Hello, I'm Richard Walker. Welcome to video number 2. A book came out in 2012 called The Mess We're In, Why Politicians Can't Fix Financial Crises. It was written by Guy Fraser-Sampson, who is someone who certainly knows his way around our financial system because it is where he makes his living. His speciality field is private equity, and we'll talk a little bit about private equity later. Apart from consultancy work, he also teaches at the Cass Business School in the City of London. As the title of his book implies, he has little time for politicians, or indeed the entire public sector. He says small government makes economic sense, greatly reducing the amount of wealth that the public sector destroys each year, both directly and indirectly. Yes, we will check out what Guy means by wealth later. He doesn't rate economists much higher. Ask the same question of 5 different economists and you'll get 5 different answers. 6 if one of them went to Harvard. His book focuses on 5 issues that he believes need to be addressed. The credit bubble that resulted in the banking crisis of 2007-2008 and its after effects as they affect the situation today. Governments repeatedly spending more than they receive in taxation and the consequent national debt. The threat of recession and possibly sustained low growth thereafter. Then there is the crisis in pension funding. And the 5th is the problem of our system of government. Guy sketches out the basis of 3 economic models: socialism, which he says has been proved not to work; Keynesian economics, which he says hasn't really been tried as Keynes intended, although I get the feeling that even if it was operated as Keynes intended, Guy would be reasonably confident that it wouldn't work. Instead, Guy favours what is known as the Austrian school, the economic ideas of Ludwig von Mises and Friedrich Hayek. And Guy says, as the great Austrian economist Ludwig von Mises pointed out in 1958, the idea that there is a third system between socialism and capitalism, as its supporters say, a system as far away from socialism as it is from capitalism, but retains the advantages and avoids the disadvantages of each, is pure nonsense. Guy says that from that it is clear that we must discard this outdated method of political and economic government that has inflicted such terrible damage. The whole rotten edifice must be swept away and replaced with something that at least may work, as opposed to the present system, which we know from bitter experience cannot possibly be expected to do so, regardless of what politicians may tell us to the contrary. They have had nearly 7 decades within which to convince us that their system works, and the facts speak for themselves. They will always prefer their own short-term interest over the long-term interests of the nation as a whole. Staring stuff. Although obviously we need to know more about where Guy wants to lead us. I'm a little wary because where he wants to lead us, by his own admission, only may work. Especially worrying because he puts that little word in italics. So what does he suggest? Well, he says about the Austrian school that there is just too much to convey in his book. And there's a whole new theory about pricing, value, and the way the market works. But what we can learn from Hayek and von Mises can be summed up briefly as small government, sound money, and individual liberty. Guy says from this springs a commitment to markets being allowed to operate freely. Left to their own devices, markets will produce a fair result as long as they operate freely. So Guy says imposing a minimum wage doesn't allow the market to operate freely and will result in less people being employed. Rent controls had to be abandoned in the UK when private landlords refused to make housing stock available. However, having said that, Guy says that the curse of economics is that it is impossible ever to come up with definitive answers. But he is certain of one thing, and that is the intellectual bankruptcy of the British government since the Second World War. That intellectual bankruptcy is seen most clearly in the Bank of England's use of quantitative easing that even by 2012 had trebled the UK's base money supply. Guy says somewhere out at sea is building a massive tsunami of monetary inflation. A tsunami which sooner or later must crash ashore with terrifying consequences. And, says Guy, a clue to the apparent indifference of the Bank of England staff towards inflation may be found in the fact that they, unlike the bulk of the population, enjoy index-linked final salary pension arrangements. Index-linked to the retail price index, by the way. This despite the fact that the bank itself clearly believes that the pensions of all lesser mortals should have to make do with the consumer price index, thus losing value in real terms with every year that passes. The trustees of the bank's own scheme naturally rejected such a ludicrous idea out of hand. Now, in his conclusion, he says that what he says may be considered radical, impractical, or just plain ridiculous, but his conclusions are the result of logical analysis of the facts. He says, my logic may be faulty, but it is sincere and honest. I have not drawn back from any of the unpleasant places to which it may have led me. Whether or not you will agree with any of my recommendations, you will at least hopefully agree that the politicians of the last 7 decades have led us to the very brink of disaster. To proceed in the same way for any longer seems to me not only ludicrous, but also deeply frightening. But we can move forward because, as a society, we claim to believe that it should be the will of the people that prevails. So, with regard to the financial boom and bust and recession that still affects us, the Bank of England should stop trying to smooth out cycles of boom and bust, since they occur naturally, and trying to prevent them just makes them worse. Instead, it should supervise the banking sector and control inflation by controlling the money supply, combining that with a written constitution, guaranteeing that the government will produce a balanced budget. Well, doing all of that should make for a healthier economy. And he does give suggestions as to how the government should balance the budget. First of all, cut overseas aid, because that would have saved £8.8 billion in 2012. Withdraw from the EU to save £9 billion in direct contributions. Remember, he wrote this book in 2012. Cut all defence spending. Yes, all ships, submarines, fighters, bombers, infantry and artillery battalions, apart from some special forces for hostage-type situations. This would save between 35 and 40 billion pounds. The welfare budget must be slashed. And finally, savings must be made by changing public sector pensions from final salary to money purchase. Then he would change the political arrangements to ensure that politicians change from short-term thinking to long-term thinking. And he ends by saying, do not look to politicians to get us out of the mess we're in. They are not the solution, but the problem. They always have been. And unless we do something to stop them, they always will be. Okay, I hope I've given an honest summary of what Guy wanted to say in his book. And obviously it is available, and you can, as with all the books I am going to look at in these videos, get hold of it, check it out for yourself. But even from my brief summary, it is obvious that Guy is covering a lot of ground. And that's without even touching on a couple of issues that I suggested in the first video might need a little investigation. Poverty and the damage we're doing to our environment. However, there is no shortage of food for thought in what Guy throws up. Although, if I am honest, I'm not at all sure that his suggestions would bring about the kind of changes that I would like to see to the society I live in and would like to leave to future generations. Now, the people he mentions who have grappled with the problems of the economy are extremely bright. Karl Marx, John Maynard Keynes, Ludwig von Mises, Friedrich Hayek are undoubtedly among the brightest individuals that our species have ever thrown up. And they are only a tiny few of the brilliant minds who have wrestled with these economic problems. Guy Fraser-Sampson himself is no one's fool. And I'm sure that if he were asked, he'd agree that many of the politicians who over the last 70 years have led us to the brink of destruction have been among the best and the brightest. The fact that all their intellectual effort has simply led to disagreement and confusion leads me to believe that something else is going on here. And Guy Fraser-Sampson includes some quotes in his book which help me illuminate what I mean. Think about this quote that he includes. As a society, we long ago stopped producing what we need: basic housing, food, clean water. We then move on to producing not what we need, but what we want. He goes on to say that there is even a point when we no longer produce what we want, but what we must be induced to want. Since there is no naturally occurring demand for such items, then demand, or rather desire, must be manufactured. And this is where the advertising industry comes in. They will promote a product as aspirational or even competitive. We buy it, not because we want it for itself, but for what it says about us. We buy this year's model of a car, even though our old one is still serving us faithfully. Not because we need it, but because our neighbours have one. We do not want to be less discerning, or the ultimate horror, less rich. Okay, now I'm no killjoy. I like new and exciting things, especially when they come as a surprise. I have nothing against anybody suggesting something new, something I hadn't thought of. Indeed, I think it is how human progress often happens. But what Guy Fraser-Sampson is saying is that as a society, we are failing to supply the basic needs for everybody, not because we lack the manpower, or the materials, or the knowledge to build sufficient well-designed, sustainable homes, or provide healthy nutrition, care, education, and entertainment for everyone. It is simply that our society produces not what is needed, but what the advertising industry can persuade us to buy. He then says that we have created a society that is obsessed by production. A society in which increased production can only be viewed as a good thing, even if it means more pollution or faster consumption of the world's natural resources. And as I've already said, Guy Fraser-Sampson is nobody's fool when it comes to finding his way around our financial system. This is where he earns his living, so we can trust his explanation of what is happening. Although, of course, it doesn't take a genius to realize that this is what is happening. Indeed, it is so much an obvious part of our life that we take it for granted. It is the very reason that James Carville told Clinton's election team to stop waffling on about the environment, education, healthcare, social justice, poverty, because, of course, there is only one thing that matters: the economy. And as Guy Fraser-Sampson says, the economy doesn't care about supplying the basic needs for everyone. All that matters is that we increase production within the economy every year, even if it means more pollution and faster consumption of the world's resources. Yes, we all know that this is what we are doing. But when you see it put as baldly as Guy Fraser-Sampson puts it, it surely has to make you question why we would behave like this. Now, Guy Fraser-Sampson didn't come up with those quotes. He took them from a much earlier book called The Affluent Society, written in the 1950s by somebody else who knew his way around our financial system, a Harvard professor of economics called J.K. Galbraith. Yes, this state of affairs has been around for a very long time, and it didn't just drop from outer space. It was not built into our DNA. Mother Nature didn't impose it on us. This weird way of organizing ourselves arises from what we seriously call the economy. A strange word to choose, because there is nothing economical about it. In fact, it would be hard to devise a method of organizing ourselves that could possibly be more wasteful. The basic operating system of our economy is obviously our financial system. And our financial system is very obviously man-made. And it was designed. And designed in such a way as to demand a continuous increase in output. Yes, I know I'm stating the obvious. It is, of course, what James Carville meant when he said that all that mattered in a successful presidential campaign was that people would believe that the candidate would be able to make the economy grow. Fulfilling basic needs won't make the economy endlessly grow. Providing well-designed, sustainable homes for everyone won't make it grow year after year. Well-designed, sustainable homes, by definition, last a long time. They don't need replacing every 3 or 4 years. An intelligent public transport system won't generate continuously increasing output. These basic needs would demand only a tiny fraction of our enormous productive capacity. Our desires, though, are only limited by the efficiency of our advertising industry. The advertising industry can generate increased production year after year. And of course, war will also allow continuous and impressive economic growth. Obviously, because there is inbuilt obsolescence as new weapons replace outdated ones. And of course, war constantly destroys infrastructure, which then guarantees more economic growth. I think that it would seem reasonable to ask the question, when and why was our financial system designed for this purpose? Strangely, Guy Fraser-Sampson comes up with what is surely a damning critique of life on Earth, not to alert us to our weird behaviour, but simply to explain why our economy has become so unstable, which makes it even worse. Here we are, year after year, quite deliberately not providing all members of society with their basic needs, which we could do without breaking sweat. And instead, year after year, we are fighting to produce more and more of what we have to be induced to want, even though it means more pollution and faster consumption of the world's natural resources. And then, as Guy says, after all that effort, all we have done is make the economy more unstable. Now, my opinion is that is not a sensible way to organize a healthy society. And I'm pretty sure that I have reasoned myself into that opinion. After all, isn't this what Professor Jared Diamond was talking about when he said that when human societies in the past failed, they did so because when the old ways of doing things became life-threatening, they chose not to change those old ways. They got on with doing what they'd always done. Hey, this is the way it's done. This is life. We can't change it. Why are you trying to mess with it? Why do you have to make things difficult? Haven't we got to ditch this way of doing things? If we wish to survive, don't we have to change what we're doing? I think so. And again, I'm sure that I have reasoned myself into that opinion. The problem is, Guy Fraser-Sampson doesn't agree. He's not interested in changing our weird behavior. In fact, he wants to make us more efficient at producing more of what we must be induced to want. Okay, now obviously he has reasoned himself into this position. So to help us understand how he has managed to do that, we need to understand what he and his wealth creators do. And that's what I'll be talking about in video number 3. Click like, subscribe, leave a comment, but watch video number 3. Thanks for watching this one.